I'm Tristan Blackingersall, and this is Black Cat's Run. I want to make a short YouTube post here because I think that this will work much better with the visual immediately in front of it. And what I want to cover in this is an example of organizing and planning training using lactate threshold. Right? It's January 1st, so I'm sure everybody's motivation to figure out how to do things differently this year is at an all-time high. Maybe this will be something that will help folks think about how they might try planning or incorporating this into your own approach. So this is an example for running with an individual athlete that I am working with right now. And this is working towards the Boston Marathon is a goal that they have for this spring. And USATF New England Road Race Series in 2024. So we started in January with a 4-week block. I'll talk through the block. I'll show you for comparison what the athlete did with this block. And then we'll talk about the next block that we have designed and what were the changes in lactate threshold between the beginning of this first block and where we are now at the beginning of the second block. So when I write and I plan training in practice, what I like to do is I like to try to think about it as a pattern. And I think sometimes people fall into the trap of, okay, I wake up, how do I feel? What do I want to do? And that becomes so heavily dictated by your level of motivation that it's very easy to get into a pattern that's inconsistent, where you might be consistently exercising every day or twice a day, but depending on how ambitious you're feeling, depending on how lethargic you're feeling, depending on how confident you're feeling, depending on what your sense of urgency is, you're going to tend to prioritize different things in ways that maybe aren't so effective. So when you plan stuff out over a longer period of time and you try to build it up as a pattern, and then you work to try to stay within that pattern or meet that expectation that you've created for yourself, or by working with a coach has, you and the coach have created for you to follow, you're more likely, I think, to have success with that. So I also, as you can see here, like to use a little bit of color coding because I think it makes it easier to think about what's happening where. So in this one, there's nothing particular about the colors. I think it just has to do with whatever I guess somewhat arbitrarily feel stands out in contrast to the other colors. But right, it just sort of sets up and makes it easier to think about and visually say, what's my pattern? So the purple are, I've said before, I don't really like the word recovery, but people might say recovery. But these are basically should be days where you are experiencing whatever your current level of fatigue is being reduced. Sometimes it's nice to do activity on these days. Sometimes it's not helpful to do activity on these days. So in this schedule, on Monday and Friday, I suggest either doing a 20-minute easy jog in the morning and the afternoon, or doing nothing at all, right? So depending on your level of fatigue, you would make a determination about what to do. Then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we do 3 LT sessions in a row. And then we also see a secondary session in the evening on Tuesday and Wednesday, but nothing on evening on Thursday. And the reason why there is nothing in the evening on Thursday is because that is the point in which over those 3 days, you would be at the highest level of fatigue. And on Thursday is when you do the longest LT intervals. So on Tuesday and Wednesday, it's 11 times 345 at LT, which for this runner right now was about 270 to 280. And then the recovery jog was 1:30 at around 230 to 240. And then the evening session here was optional. And this was to just jog for 10 minutes and go out and do 10 by 20 second strides at, a pace that's, up tempo, quicker maybe than lactate threshold for sure, but not at a point where you're turning it into this thing that you have to be like amping yourself up for, getting worked up to go and do. And that was just doing, so I said 15K to 6K pace, right? Not even trying to give it a specific wattage. Why don't I want to give this a specific wattage? It's because I don't want to turn it into a workout, right? We're more about feeling good. When I coached high school cross country, for example, I didn't want to call the strides because, I think, and I was influenced, of course, by my experience of strides being this like competitive maximum sprint competition. So I used to call them floats because I wanted the term to emphasize the quality, right? But for more mature athletes, you don't necessarily need to, play games with the terminology like that per se. You can just sort of agree on what that intensity is, and then they're probably not doing it with 15 or 20 other people, so probably doing it by themselves, so they're not really testing themselves against other people in that context. So any one of those sessions in and of itself is, not super intensive, right? Because it's at lactate threshold, and I suggest testing after rep 6, checking the lactate in your recovery interval. There's plenty of time in the recovery interval to do that. You can do this on a treadmill. You can do it outside. So if you do it outside and you have your lactate meter, you can just get a hand warmer or a rechargeable hand warmer and put it in the bag that the lactate threshold meter is in, and then it won't get too cold in the winter. But you stop and you test, and that way you can verify. And if the lactate is high, then you're going to want to reduce your watts. And then the Thursday session is 4 by 9 minutes at lactate threshold. Now we're trying to get to the point where if we continue to do another session, like maybe in that afternoon or the following morning, at that point you would start to notice fatigue. We're hopefully not getting into significant fatigue before that point. Hopefully we are getting to the point of, feeling like if we do another session, it will start to get tiring, right? And that's the appropriate time to back off because we're staying with that proximal development approach. And so then Friday, we go easy. And then Saturday and Sunday, I use the X factor term from the Marius backend because that was a concept the athlete and I had been talking about. I don't think that, and I put the Saturday in red, right? Because to me, that emphasizes that this is more intensive. I don't think that this is particularly essential per se, but I think that it's adding a benefit where if you didn't have all the lactate threshold stuff going on, this would be useless. But because you have the lactate threshold stuff going on, and if you go out and you do something like this, it's going to be more effective. And this is not a session that I'm defining as VO2 max or LT2 or anything like that, because I don't believe, as I've said on the podcast many, many times by now, I don't think that the evidence supports those as real sort of substantive things to be trying to assert exist as physiological markers. So why should you design training around an imaginary intensity? But I do think, as is clearly the case, that training more intensively does have an effect. I think one of the mistakes people make with this stuff is they assume that, in the classic running experience, certainly in the States for people, is to assume that doing intervals, the more reps you can do, the shorter the recovery, the faster the intervals, that is what creates the better athlete. So doing, something Zatopecian, like doing, 25, 30 by quarter mile repeats, right, would be a classic sort of Zatopecian workout. He might have done 60 of those. But then people make the mistake of thinking that they're doing them at a particular kind of intensity that is a particular level of productivity, and that's not really the case. And I think that if Zatopek was an athlete now, he would be running significantly faster because he would take in new information and use that to think about modifying his intensity and his approach. And so with this idea in mind, that the purpose of doing this is to, work at a high level, so the fatigue is going to accumulate very quickly. And after you've gotten to that point, there's no additional benefit to be gained from continuing to pump these out. And so we did something different for each of these Saturdays. And in this first week, it was 2 by 800. And I wrote 15-minute recovery, 15-minute easy jog in between. But we really ended up agreeing that basically we just wanted full recovery, right? So we're doing these at full recovery, and that means we're actually doing them like in the manner that is beneficial, in a manner with quality. And for this long run on Sunday, we started with a 1.5 hour run at slower than LT with a 5-minute pickup to LT watts after 25 minutes, 55 minutes, and 85 minutes. And the reason why the long run is 1.5 hours for somebody who's training toward a marathon goal is because, number one, you don't just want to go out and just start pumping out long runs with this sort of blind faith approach that, okay, as long as I start cranking these, I'm going to get faster and faster and faster. And number two, this was in the month of December, and the primary driver of performance for aerobic endurance sports, and all endurance sports, I think by part of definition, must be aerobic sports. A primary driver is lactate threshold. So the week is a training session, right? And then the whole block is a training session. Instead of thinking about training sessions as I show up, I do hard, easy, hard, easy, hard, easy, and I repeat like this. And then I go to the next day and I do the next workout. Think of the whole training as load, recovery, right? The whole training process, the whole training pattern is a continuous workout, a workout in which you experience growth if you're patterning what you're doing effectively. And so then we repeated this pattern down, as you can see here, as I scroll down, we repeated this pattern down for 4 weeks. And I think you could do it for 3 weeks. You could do it for 2 weeks. I have found that it seems to be the case that if you do, as you can see, right, again, recurring the pattern of training, if you take workouts, like do those workouts several times. I know that there's a lot of idea of like novelty and variety being essential. And I think that that's true, but not always in the way that people think, that like jumping from this thing to this thing to this thing, isn't necessarily inherently beneficial, right? And there is a lot of variety going on in here. We aren't doing just one training session. And then as we move into the next block, you'll see we make what I think are some natural evolutions based on assumptions we can make about the progression of fitness, both in terms of endurance level of fitness and the lactate threshold development. So the only things to emphasize that change here is our second X factor was 8 times 150 meter hill at 3 to 4% grade at, when I just sort of said, at 1 mile watts, right? So pick your kind of your wattage that you think you could do for a 1 mile race and do that accordingly. Then for the third week, we did 3 by 600. And then for the last week, we had said to try to do a 1200 meter fast as they like, right? And so one of the aspects of this was to hopefully then demonstrate to the athlete that even though they're not doing all of the traditional level of range of higher intensity sessions, right, using these concepts of VO2 max and LT2, that they're actually getting, not only are they getting faster, that they're not only there's a lactate threshold improving, but their quote unquote speed is improving, right? Because if you can crank down for say a 1200 meter for 3/4 mile effort, you have to be pretty quick. And this is an athlete who was an excellent middle distance half mile runner in high school and college. So they're familiar with, right, the kind of like benchmarking of like, well, if I can do blank, that's a really good sign for fitness. So then they recorded, and I have this over here, they recorded a little bit of what they did as they went along through the training pattern. So you can look at this and contrast, right? And one of the things I've talked about in this concept is that of training is that executing the concept is more important than executing the plan. And I think this is a really good demonstration of this. So you're going to see, right, that the athlete doesn't literally do every single individual detail in the manner that is prescribed, right? But what you see, right, is that they're working to execute the concept. So, right, you're still seeing, right, that the time emphasis of LT sessions is in there. So that first Tuesday, they wanted to actually do a step test, which I suggest people do these as 10-minute intervals, testing between each interval and then increasing the wattage by maybe like 20 watts. And then, right, there was some fatigue, from doing that, because that test, might take 60, 70 minutes, and you're tending, especially this athlete got all the way up to like 11.8 millimole on their last step. So they progressed up to a pretty high level of intensity. So the next day they went easy, but then they come back and they do, right, the 11 by 345, right? And you can see here, right, the lactate maybe a little bit higher than we want. Power maybe also, though, was a little bit higher than we had targeted. But, right, we're working towards that concept. And this is going to happen when you do this stuff, right? You're going to not always get the exact lactate number you want, especially if you are trying to train down from a higher intensity mindset. It's going to be difficult to do this, right? Then being willing to take rest days. You're going to see, right, that the what was highlighted in green over here, these secondary sessions, and we had decided that those would be an optional thing. They're a supplemental thing. So they chose not to really do those as they went along. There's nothing wrong with that. And then on Saturday, right, we see they're going out and doing the 800s. And they put their wattages in for that, and then they went out and did the longer run. And you can see, right, even taking a lactate reading at the end of the long run. So, right, and then you can go to week 2, right? We're seeing, right, the pattern here. We've got 11 by 345, 4 by 10, 12 by 345, right? We've got the high intensity, we've got the long run, and then they started tracking their miles. So that was like a 68-mile week. So when you look at this training plan, it might be something where you look at this and you think, oh, but that's so little, you're not really training that much. And you want to remember that your mileage is such a poor indicator of your training load, because how much you train in terms of mileage is a huge impact of, hugely affected by how hilly your runs are, by what's your velocity at lactate threshold, and then, what your training design is, right? So here it's like, well, we have 2 days where we have like suggestion of doing just 2 20-minute jogs at most, yet we're seeing this athlete get to 68 miles, right? Well, they're still spent this week, 8 hours and 15 minutes exercising, right? So even though you don't see this as being, oh, but where's the 70 miles a week, right? Because a lot of times training plans are presented to us as being a pattern of higher level training has more mileage. Lower, like you've got the 50-mile-a-week plan, you got the 70-mile-a-week plan, you got the 90-mile-a-week plan. And I don't think that's the right way to design training. The mileage is a symptom of fitness. And it's just traditionally people have believed that certain mileage counts lead to certain outcomes. And if you're a cyclist and you're still watching this, and you only cycle, I would suggest that like it's the same concept, right? That a certain number of hours a week aren't inherently more or less beneficial. That it's about what you're doing with that time, and you want to design the training to be productive. And then the mileage will play out the way it plays out, or the hours will play out the way they play out, right? And you can see here their last 2 weeks, right? Still trying to emphasize those LT workouts. And then with the long runs, the specific intensity in the last week, they ended up not doing the 1200. They were going to do a 1 mile race, but that ended up sort of falling apart in terms of, other participants not being able to be there. So they just did a retest on the lactate threshold. And I don't have a graph for that I can show, but to emphasize what we've seen as the change here for this athlete is they basically went from being a lactate threshold of maybe, let's say, we went from working out at like 200, maybe around 270 was sort of the target for this in terms of, right, looking at that point of accumulation. So they were, for example, at a 254 watts, they were 1.1 millimoles at the beginning of this block. And then at 271 watts, they were 1.4 millimoles. And then at 289 watts, they were 2.2 millimoles. And then with this retest, at 243 watts, they were 2.2. And I think, right, there's some variance in errors, and some people will exhibit a higher lactate level when they're initially warming up. So then at 268, they were 1.5. At 273 watts, they were 1.0. At 287 watts, they were 1.0. And at 298 watts, they were 1.4. So, right, essentially you're looking at an increase of about 30 watts, which is pretty good. And you're right, you see that most of the time in their workouts, they're trying to be as close to 1 as possible, right? So, and you look, right, we saw at the beginning, the lactate meter levels were a little bit high, but then by the last 2 weeks, they're coming down and we're seeing like 1.1 to 1.5, 1.6, those kinds of values, right? And getting better at targeting the level of intensity, right? And so what's happening though, of course, across this time period is the increase in lactate thresholds happens across the time period. And if you're spot checking your lactate and you have a strategy to do that, like checking halfway and at the end of a workout, like you can see, for example, this workout right here, 4 by 10 minutes, they were 0.7, 0.9, 1, and then 1.8, right? And right, so it's okay, the end of this workout may be a little bit, right, starting to get a little bit higher than we want, right? That might be indicative of fatigue. It might also be indicative of, trying to do too much power. But this was on their treadmill, and they don't seem to have good success getting their treadmill power to work in the same way with the Stride. I don't have this problem. I haven't really figured out why that's happening for them because I don't work for Stride, but I haven't had an issue with that. But regardless, right, what's key here is we're looking at the lactate levels, okay? So, and their other workouts are outdoors unless it says otherwise. So we go down here to block 2. So this is the next block this athlete is going to do. So like we showed about a 30 watt increase. And just to reiterate, if we go back to that, well, what were they at 1.0 watts? What did that, 1.0 watts, excuse me, who cares what we're at 1.0 watts. 1 watts is basically not moving. But in their first test, they were 1.1 millimoles at 254. And in their second test, they were 287 watts at 1.1 millimoles, right? So again, we're looking at about a 30 watt increase plus or minus 2 or 3 watts. So I highlighted in yellow the changes here that we made. And now it's following the same strategy of we set a new pattern and then we maintain that pattern for 4 weeks. And then we're going to reassess and see where we're at. And then we're going to make an adjustment, right? So first of all, right, when you have evidence that your strategy is working, you don't want to suddenly start doing things completely differently. Like one of the things the athlete had wondered about is, well, should I be doing workouts for 3 millimoles? Because the next race they're going to do is like a 4 miler in early February. And I said that, well, if you start working out that intensity, you're not really getting any additional benefit than you're already getting by working out at correctly identified lactate threshold. And you're probably just going to go stale, right? So we don't want to fall into the trap of, I'm starting to, because that's what happens is you start to feel good because now your fatigue is being managed properly. and you're not constantly generating huge levels of muscular fatigue where your recovery, right, the point at which you start to feel better again is very like inconsistent and unpredictable. Well, then people start wanting to go hard because that's more rewarding, and we're still trained in our brain, right? Our automatic training instinct is to think that that's most productive. So what did we change here? Well, on Tuesday and Thursday, we just subtly changed the two workouts. So on the Tuesday workout, we just took 15 seconds out of the recovery and put it into the work interval. So instead of it being 3:45, 1:30, it's 4 minutes, 1:15, right? And this might seem small enough to be insignificant, right? But if you continue to make these scale of changes over, say, 6 months or a year or longer, right? Well, those add up, right? Pretty significantly, right? And so like one long-term goal might be for this athlete to do all of their LT intervals of 10 minutes, or to start having their LT sessions. Maybe some of those are going to become just continuous runs instead of broken intervals. But we don't really know what we're going to end up. We're going to follow, right, the data, right? And if we're exhibiting great progression, we don't want to necessarily make the training harder to make it harder. But what we do want to do, because we do know this is effective, is if we can find ways to sort of like add a little bit more time at LT, that we're going to continue to see training response, right? And that if we're, following a good training pattern, then we shouldn't have an issue with fatigue. So this is a subtle change, but cumulatively over time, right, we're going to be, adding in additional sort of training stimulus to achieve our goal. So we kept the Wednesday workout the same. The Thursday workout, I just said, let's just do 4 by 10 minutes. And then for in the green here, I suggested that they could do the strides, or another option now I suggested would be to jog for 10 minutes and then just do a 20-minute run at their LT zone. And you can see that we've changed the LT watts from 285 to 305. And then we're keeping the Mondays and the Fridays purple. The athlete had talked about how for them, they felt that, keeping these days very easy, these purple days very easy, or have the option of taking days off was really key to just continuing to be able to feel good, right? And that's the right mindset of, right, we're trying to think about, are we managing our fatigue? Because our fatigue isn't what leads to training response, it's what prevents training response. So Saturday, we still have X Factor. And for the X Factor, we have the first week, I'm suggesting to do a 400, 1,000, a 400. And these are all at that same kind of self-selected, fast, but not all-out intensity. And then we'll do some intensity over some hills. So 2 by 200, 2 by 150, 2 by 100, 2 by 50. Is there anything special or magical about this compared to 8 by 150? No. But I think that, right, you have some variance that makes it a little bit more mentally interesting. I think with the higher intensity stuff, I think it's sometimes actually better to not keep doing the same session every single time because, right, what is the expression? Comparison is the thief of joy. You don't want to be comparing because that's where people are really, because this is so close to maybe what we associate with the intensity of performance. We're going to really hone in on trying to say, well, am I doing this the same or better? When really what we want to look at is the lactate threshold as the driver for improvement. So because the lactate threshold has gone up, then what we should be seeing here in general is better. It's going to be a better level of performance. And then we have 3 by 600. Again, so that would be the one session we'd keep the same. So that would be 4 weeks later, they can come back to this, right? And at that point, it will probably be reasonable to see an improvement. So we're not going to be creating like an identity crisis of, is this working? And the watts aren't going up enough. My velocity isn't going up enough. And then 2 by 800 here at the end, right? And then, you could change this stuff as you go, right? You could say, oh, it'd be more interesting to maybe they want to do a 1,500 meter time trial or something like that. But I think keeping these, work intervals certainly below 4 or 5 minutes. And if you can go a little bit easier in terms of what's the training load you're sort of leveraging on yourself, that's probably better, right? But it's not about apply more and more work, get more and more benefit. That is not the way this stuff works, right? You want to recognize that you just need to do a very modest amount. And then anything else additional to that is just making yourself exhausted, and you're just like performing. You're not improving, right? You're showing that you can do all of these repetitions, and that's great, but that's just reflecting fitness. You're going to go into a big recovery crisis. In particular, we want to be able to come back the next day and do the long run. I don't think there's anything especially significant about doing the long run the day after the X Factor, except that if you did the long run first, then you're going to be totally flat and you're not going to be able to do these higher intensity things. So for the long run, now we're making an evolution in the long run. And what we've done is I divided the long run into an endurance-focused long run and a stamina-focused long run. And if you've listened to the podcast, we've had some conversation about doing long runs and how we should approach those. And we've got another part, forthcoming down the road here where we talk about some other long run strategies. But this is kind of an introduction to this, where think about, right, what's your goal, right? A lot of people think their goal is to run 20 miles. Well, that's not a good goal. It'd be like, why do you want to run 20 miles? So I think we want to ask ourselves the question, why do we want to do a long run? We want to do a long run because we believe there's benefit to running for a longer duration of time than we can get, that is different and more important or essential than we need for running for a shorter duration of time. Now, one of those things is we want to be able to run for the time duration that we anticipate our marathon being at. We want to be able to run for that time duration and not be getting tired just by running for that long. Because if we get tired just by running for the time duration of the race event, to the point where we're like having to stop or we're slowing down dramatically, no matter how easy we start out at, then we're not adequately prepared or fit to be, attempting that race. So the endurance long run is just to go out and run for this athlete for 2.25 to 2.75 hours. And I think you might eventually, for this person, want to get this up to more like 2.75 to 3 hours. They're like a 240 runner who I think should be able to run, in the mid 230s. And just, obviously there's variables that lead to the impact on that performance, but if the lactate threshold can improve as much as we're thinking it's going to, then they should be able to make a jump from the 240 range to the 230 range, which would be awesome. So for the endurance long run, though, we do add a minute LT every 10 minutes, and just to add some level of that in there. I also just think that psychologically it maybe will help people sort of, okay, I need to be easy and then I'm going to pick it up, versus a lot of people just fall into probably running at an intensity that's actually over lactate threshold basically the whole time. And it's actually very easy to do that, but it's not productive. Because then you're just going to be wrecked, and then you're not going to be able to do what you want to do, which is completing the overall pattern of training. And then the other long run strategy we have here is what I'm going to call a stamina long run. And the thought process, the emphasis behind this session is to try to more specifically, now, to be clear, right, all time spent training is going to have some sort of an impact on your aerobic capacity for exercise. So it's not to say that the endurance long run doesn't do this, but that the point of that run is to be able to run for time, right? And that's why I said endurance. I would define endurance as the ability to keep going at any given pace. Stamina is the ability to sustain a given pace. So for this stamina long run, the first one in this block is 15 miles with 1 mile at 250 to 270. So trying to stay below lactate threshold, but, still running at, moving along at a reasonable, but relaxed tempo, right? So not necessarily for this athlete, not necessarily at running 12-minute pace, but, trying to mindfully stay below threshold. And so alternate 1 mile at that intensity, easy running, relaxed running, however you want to think about that. And then 800 meter at threshold intensity, which is also easy and relaxed. It's just a more like intentional. You don't need to concentrate to maintain lactate threshold, you usually need to concentrate to not exceed lactate threshold. So then we come back and we do another endurance long run. And then the last stamina long run we have charted in the block is 30K run, where we're just going 2K at sub threshold at 250 to 270 watts, and then 1K at 285 to 305 watts. So, and as we're going to probably see, as before, right, now the execution is going to be different from the plan, right? Because we looked at the first block, right? We have this, color-coded thing that looks very precise, right? And then we go over here, right, and we see that the way we do things in practice is different than the way we do them when we're mapping them out, the way we do the process of conceptualizing training. And I don't think that's bad. I think that's good, right? So you might be doing 80% of what you planned, but because, right, the athlete here and I have talked about and we develop an understanding of what we want to try to do, all right? And the things that I'm writing down are a suggestion, right? They're sort of the jumping off point for this is what we want to try to accomplish, and then, right, empowering individuals to do what they, find to be most sort of appropriate based on how they're feeling at any given time. That's what makes good training effective. So if you are curious to see other examples of this, other blueprints for how to approach training pattern, whether it's hypothetical or real in practice examples, please feel free to reach out to us at our Instagram page at Black Cats Run, or I suppose you can just comment below on the video. Thanks for listening, watching, and we'll catch you next time.